Welcome again to another episode of the Cohesity View. My name is John Hildebrand. I'm a principal technologist here at Cohesity. And joining me today are two of my illustrious coworkers. So go ahead and why don't we introduce ourselves? Vic, you go first.
Hey everybody, my name is Vic Camacho. I am a principal technologist here at Cohesity and looking forward to this.
And my name's Theresa Miller. I'm the Director of Technology Advocacy, and I'm excited to be an illustrious guest today.
Yeah, I want to make sure that my coworkers here get as much praise as possible. Plus, the manager's here at the same time, so any brownie points I'll go for. So today we've got a pretty extensive list of topics ranging from outages to services that are critical for a lot of folks these days to basically the government telling us to put up a shield moving forward. So, Theresa, I think we're going to start with your topic first, which is going to be about those service outages. So, why don't we go into what it was and we'll get a little banter going on after that.
Absolutely. So, one of the things that caught my attention recently is that there was an article about Discord and Spotify, a couple of cloud services that most of us have likely used or at least have heard of, had some pretty decent outages recently. And as I started doing some research on it, there wasn't a lot of clarity around what caused the outage, but it was very impacting to customers. And so it got me thinking about why outages, and the challenges around that. So I wanted to kind of kick that out to the team here and get your thoughts on just outages as a whole and perhaps how that's tied to what we're seeing from the security landscape.
Well, I mean, anytime there's an outage, there's a big disruption, right? Folks are used to using these tool sets, and so whenever they don't have access to something like this, it's a big disruption. I think we've seen this played out over the years, right? Especially when you, not, I guess, put all your eggs on one basket, but there have been outages to large communication tools. And so when something like that happens, what do? Do you go back to email? Do you go back to phone calls? So for me, it's about disruption and, workforce not being as efficient because the line of communication has been broken. And in our world, that is pretty key, right? It's about communicating and having the latest intel or information so that you can go about your normal day.
Yeah, and I would state that, from especially the Discord perspective, there's quite a bit of folks. Think of it, it's being used a lot more in the sense of, say, like Slack is being used, but elevated even greater. And I'll even admit being a gamer nerd at this particular, with what I do in my spare time, Discord was noticeable from my perspective because I wasn't able to communicate with the other people that I play with. So if you're using that from a business perspective, as Vic, you just mentioned, you're going to be missing a path of communication, and therefore you're going to end up basically blind trying to figure out what to do before we had these particular tools to get your day-to-day jobs or your task at hand that you were trying to do with Discord as an example, or just to be entertained in the form of Spotify with its outage.
So it's interesting you mentioned that because when I think about the Spotify side of the outage, I have a family member that uses Spotify for music, but it is a common podcast platform as well. But it forced them to find another option and even had them questioning the quality of the service to the degree that they were even looking at other product options already. And I don't even think the outage was that long. So not only is the impact short term, it can have long term business impact as well. So I think avoiding outages and doing what you can to keep systems online is probably the best course of action.
Yeah, I think that, and I think you make a good point there, right? Even though these outages might be short, it's not short when you're driving down the freeway and you have kids in the car and your music has just went out, right? You have a lot of dead air silence, when you're thinking about it from that perspective. So, and then the long term effects, right? This could cause folks to look at other avenues, right? That could be potentially some lost business in the case of Spotify. And so, looking at that, you really start to think about what it means to have business continuity, right? What are we going to do around that? How can we help avoid those mistakes? Because business is business, and you can lose business for something short, right? It's all brand image, right? What's the damage to our name? Has there been damage to our name because of this? So a lot of implications when you start to think about things like that.
Yeah, and I can say for those of us who've worked in healthcare beforehand, that one of the things that we've had to realize is the tech decisions that we make can ripple to somebody's life. Now, granted, Spotify going out may not necessarily have the same impact to someone else's quality of life from, say, an EMR application, as an example, but you can ripple these effects to the point where, as you mentioned, now folks are questioning the quality of the particular product because of a single outage, regardless of how long it was. If even if it was a 15-minute outage, that's 15 minutes in a day where we're all instant gratification. 15 minutes was a long time for not having your music available and not being able to switch over to something else as a backup in case you forgot that your phone can actually have music on it that isn't streamable over the internet at that point. So it's one of these sorts of things that, yes, it ripples. Outages do cause problems to a business. There's your reputation that you have to worry about. But at the same time, we do have to realize no one's ever going to be able to hold a 100% uptime. So outages are going to happen on occasion. It would be interesting to note if we knew what the cause of the outage was, whether it was something nefarious on the back end, or in the case of sometimes where we run into Amazon. I think back to the first S3, well, we won't call it an outage because they didn't call it an outage at that point, but it caused a queue up of S3 objects, and it basically netted that nobody could use the service because it was waiting, everything was waiting in a queue to write down to S3 at that point. So we're it's one of these sorts of things that, depending upon the architecture of the app, what sort of things were happening, was it somebody else's problem that the app was built upon? We didn't really get that type of public reveal on some of these outages, which would have been nice to at least understand where these outages were coming from and at least communicated in a honest fashion to those of us who are paying for these particular services.
I
Yeah,
suspect in time that will come out. I think they have to disclose it. Um, but yeah, for today, it really wasn't clear.
yeah. I think in the, I guess in the I'll call it the public space, right? We like to know what's going on, right? We're paying for this service. Now, if you're internal, right, there's always those activities, post-mortem activities, to figure out what was the thing, what was the crux of the matter, what caused this outage. Was it a change we did on the inside, internally? Did we make a change that affected this? So having those effective post-mortem activities is key, so that you can avoid those costly mistakes later, right? Sometimes it's just a mistake. Until that post-mortem happens, to Theresa's point of view, is we're not going to know until we know. It's just one of those things we have to deal with when you consume a service like that.
Well, and I'd go one step further, that we're talking about, you're talking about the postmortems, and I've done a lot in like the theory of DevOps. Prior to starting here at Cohesity, I did a lot of community presentations. One of the key things is not only do you have a postmortem, but you have a blameless postmortem. You don't want to essentially try to hook one engineer as being the entire problem of the entire org as why something went down. Generally, the person isn't necessarily the problem. There's a process problem that broke down somewhere in there that poor person executed at that point, and They were just the person who pushed the button. The button didn't perform the way it was supposed to.
It's a really good point, John. I know in larger organizations I've worked in, healthcare definitely being one of them. But the postmortem process, I like that you mentioned blameless. It always was in the enterprises I worked in. It was considered a learning opportunity. And and then you remediated so that it wouldn't or couldn't happen again.
Yeah, that it's important to note that, right? I've worked for organizations that kind of were pointing fingers, and I've worked for organizations that were really good about, let's just take this opportunity to learn so that we don't repeat this again. Uh, I definitely prefer the second, the latter part of that, because it is right. It's just an opportunity to learn, and everybody gets something from it, right?
Yep. So moving on, we're going to move on to another topic here, as I think we're starting to that horse is getting a little bludgeoned at that particular point. We're going to start talking about data exfiltration, assuming I can talk and actually pronounce the term at this particular point. Recently, as in within the last 24 hours of this recording, we've got the Lapsus group, who's been exfiltrating some pretty high-ranking companies out there that provide a lot of services that most of us depend upon in the enterprise, whether that's Okta or in some particular cases Microsoft. They've been maneuvering around company networks and snagging source code and posting source code online, along with compromised account information from these particular organizations. So we're seeing that evolution of hacking getting back into the exfiltration side of the equation rather than just a simple disruption to operations in the form of, say, ransomware. At that point, they're going for, the golden pot of source code at this point. So the thing that I've got to ask you guys here is, how worrisome is that to supply chains, knowing full well that these groups are specifically targeting out and trying to snag source code of some of the prominent services that even you or I use on a regular basis?
I think that it's very important. I mean, and breaches can happen any multiple way, any type of way, whether that is an internal person who accidentally clicks on a link, right? Which would then, for me in my head, because I've been in the cybersecurity space, I'm thinking, well, what kind of access does this person have already, right? You start thinking about zero trust and least privilege access so that they can't affect all systems, right? We certainly don't want a lot of administrators running around the environment because that poses a risk. And if business is anything, it's mitigating risk wherever and whenever you can, right? To place your organization in the best possible position for success. Cybersecurity is no different. If you're not thinking about that today, there's some grave effects that can happen because of that. There's simple checks and balances. The technology, the solutions exist today, but let's talk through that, right? I'd like to get your point of views on this.
Yeah. So, well, first of all, I just want to mirror your point on the concern of this overall. It's you have outside entities placing ransomware that is not only encrypting data, but it's exfiltration of data and then posting it publicly. If I were running a company, or if I was the CISO of a company, I wouldn't be sleeping very well right now, knowing that I was responsible for the corporate data that is most likely going to be impacted, right? Because it's no longer if, it's when. But then the other side of your question is, how do we put the right processes in place to hopefully do some level of prevention? And besides educating users, I think the other one I'd want to add to that is multi-factor authentication. And while Okta's not truly just flat out multi-factor, there's a multi-factor element. Hearing that Okta was impacted and all the pass-through mechanisms and multi-factor you put in place has me worried. What do you guys think?
Well, yeah, that definitely has me worried. Almost to the particular point where you're thinking about what happens from a personal perspective if my PayPal account gets compromised. The whole idea was to obfuscate my credit card information so that I wasn't transmitting credit card information directly over the internet all the time. I basically used this service to auto pass this information in I don't want to say necessarily an encrypted fashion, but in a way that it isn't easily sniffable from an internet perspective. So from that perspective, it's almost as if now you're setting up that one location and it's turning into the one access point where somebody can jump off and gain access to all of your applications as you instead of just an individual application. So it's part of the risks to the system when you add so much into one basket, so to speak. So you end up there's a inherent risk that you run when that particular service does get compromised. Like I said, no different than say PayPal in that regard. All my credit card information would be compromised if my PayPal account was compromised in some particular fashion. So I would consider this no different except for corporate application access at that point.
Yeah, that's
So I wonder if part of this then is their response, right? We need the details on how far this breach took things to be comfortable, because you talked about a lot of the security mechanisms they put in place that maybe perhaps it's not as bad as we think.
yeah. I think you have to think about, well, because I haven't read through the entire article yet, but it is concerning, right? These are supposed to be layered approaches to security. Was it something in the source code they took advantage of? So I haven't really read through the article, but to John's point, you rely on these things to secure your data. In the example of PayPal, I use the same thing. So is my data secure? And there's always going to be a risk when you click on something, right? Some of these, these cyber criminals, they're smart, right? They're crafty. They just happen to stand on the wrong side of that integrity line. So, they exist. So we have to mitigate wherever and whenever we can. So what does that look like, especially if something like an Okta has been compromised, right? I'd be interested to see what is going to come out of this. Again, to our earlier point, it's another learning opportunity. We can take this event and learn from it so that we can avoid it in the future.
Well, one of the things also to note is that the article did mention something about the fact that, especially in the Microsoft portion of the article, that an employee did get their information compromised, but they did have MFA enabled, but the Lapsus group took one step further and then hacked the person's phone so that they could get access to the MFA code that was necessary for them to get in. And they used social engineering tactics by attempting to try to get that particular account's information changed by spoofing themselves as that particular user and calling up the administrative team to try to get them to change the password, to change the MFA information, to change just how that account was operating at that particular point. So they were throwing literally every tactic they possibly could at this. And in some particular cases, we can say that the process has failed, that somebody was able to get their phone hacked, that they were able to get their account hacked, and then the social engineering tactics were being used so that they could end up spoofing themselves as that particular user and getting somebody else to act on their particular account accord and change things as that particular user in the environment. So this was, I would say, a catastrophic failure almost of all the different techniques that we try to say to be on your guard about, that they failed miserably in a lot of these particular cases, which means either we've become too dependent upon the technology to do the job, which at the end of the day, we've been told things like two-factor authentication that involves SMS is risky because SMS can be sniffed rather easily. Now, by hacking a phone, your Okta Verify number is easily able to be gotten, or somebody can act on that accord on your phone and click the button that says, yes, that's me. So that layer of security is easily defeated once that particular phone becomes compromised at the same time. So again, this felt like it was multiple layers of failure across the board, which easy for me to say, casting stones from far away, but this definitely feels like a failure of multiple processes from a security perspective, and the whole idea of working towards zero trust. I feel that instead of giving everybody keys to the kingdom and paring it back, we have to give everybody nothing and slowly give them something instead. So we have to work from the other direction when it comes to these particular privileges that we're operating and giving to people. The just enough administration principles have to be hammered home moving forward, and folks are going to have to realize that they can't have convenience and security at the same time. They will be impacted in some particular fashion by the way that moving scale works as far as organizational privileges go.
Well said.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I think that organizations, though, that if they're going to move forward with a more restrictive route, which, like you said, is very necessary, they're going to have some very heavy business communication to keep the business, we'll call them stakeholders, right? Your business users definitely need to be aware of what's going on, or it's going to feel painful.
Yep. All right, Vic. Let's head over to you for the last topic of the day. We have some interesting things going on in the world these days.
We do, right? So clearly there's the whole war going on between Russia and excuse me. So there's a lot going on, right, in the political landscape, and so much that our government is saying, hey, be on the lookout for attacks, whether they're ransomware or some kind of a attack vector coming into the organization, because we're putting sanctions on Russia, because because of the Russian and Ukraine events going on today, which is horrible, right? This is a horrible thing going on, and so there are sanctions being placed on Russia by U.S. and others, and so they've essentially, the government has come up with a shields up by the CISA group, right? CISA, and it's about ensuring that you have controls in place because they are expecting that there's going to be retaliation, and so we already know that Russian hackers have attempted, right, to breach. They've attempted to disrupt our voting systems, things of that nature. But in this regard, they want us to be organizations to be ready because they know that it's coming down the line. And so there's been President Biden has also put a statement out, things of that nature. And so this is going to be something that's not going to go away anytime soon, right? And so as long as we're applying pressure, I'm sure that there's going to be some retaliation. Even the United States government is telling everybody, let's gear up for this because it's going to happen. And so these are some of the things that you can do. I'd like to get your points of view on this, about what's going on and maybe some of those things that we should be looking at as an organization.
Yeah. So let me just kind of start with some thoughts. So I'm glad this came out. The guidance in there covers things like multi-factor authentication, think before you click, and they have some other recommendations. But when we look at what the ransomware landscape was even before this war started, it's unfortunate it took this for the guidance to come out, because I think the risk has always been there. It's just now amplified.
Absolutely, and you know that's a good point, right? I think given today's landscape, organizations should be operating from a state of risk mitigation. So much has made the news about other organizations, and in every single industry, healthcare, retail, public sector, education. So it's permeated every single industry. Nobody is safe, right? And so if something like this has to come up and re-spark that, I'm all for it. But we really should be operating from the stance that, hey, this is happening. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when, especially if we don't have those controls in place. That's my take on that.
Yeah, and especially knowing full well, I'm actually surprised that it, again, it took this particular event for us to realize and push this from even from a government perspective. I mean, we've already seen disruptions to, I don't want to say just direct supply chain, but energy supply chain. We've seen energy pipeline disruption because of these particular attacks. Can you imagine what would happen to energy grids and things like that if we didn't have the ability to power certain things because we were at the risk, at the should say at the mercy of one of these organizations holding a power grid hostage at that point? The
Yeah.
ripple effect is huge to day-to-day life. So I'm I'm very surprised that this hasn't been at the forefront even before a geopolitical conflict broke out between Russia and the Ukraine. So this sounds like something that probably needs to be a permanent thing and constantly revisited from this particular government perspective, and ensuring that organizations are prepared and constantly realizing the risk of not having your shield up, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. You make a good point, right? We should be, putting these controls in place for certain. I think about what you just said, and if someone had access to a power grid or control of it, I'm thinking the first thing that comes to my mind are first responders. I'm thinking, they need to be able to communicate back and forth because those are people's lives on the line. I'm thinking about healthcare, right? John, you and Teresa, both of you have had stints in healthcare as I have as well. And I'm thinking, what if they don't have the right data for a patient and they're given something that doesn't do well in their body, or they don't have access to the EMR system? You start to think about those things where, if hopefully they have a backup solution, right? So some kind of generator going. I would think that they would, but again, you're operating in a degraded state and people's lives are on the line. So that's the first thing that comes to my mind. It's a bit alarming. It's a bit alarming when you think about it that way.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it does sound like a plot line to a movie. But the realization is, this is about as real as you can get. These
Yeah.
folks are one, two, three steps away from taking over things that you would consider isolated from the rest of the world network, so to speak. So you know, it is highly alarming that these are the targets that people are going after nowadays, and all it takes is one account compromised, just as we learned from the Lapsus group, one account compromised in an interesting fashion, and they've got the keys to the kingdom. So it's heavily worrisome, knowing full well that that's how fragile, in some particular cases, the security prospects at certain organizations are, who are supposed to be protecting critical infrastructure like that.
Well, to Teresa's point, right? They've come out with recommendations, and there is a checklist, right? There's a link that points to a checklist of things to look out for, right? There's, they talk about detection and analysis, right? Think about that. Being able to identify if you are being attacked. So again, solutions that exist today, you just need to, you know, vet the one that fits your organization, and start to look and give a serious look to this, right? Because your data is important. Your intellectual property is important. Customer data, patient data. This is all that's very personal to folks, especially protected health information, right? So For a lot of people, that's a lot, given today's landscape with vaccinations and stuff. So people want to keep that close to the vest.
Yeah, I think maybe what we should do for our audience today is go ahead and make sure that we have that link to that website down in the description for this, because it is important. It's a good reference as well, whether it's because of what's going on with Russia and Ukraine or not. I think it's good security practices to hold for now and for the future.
Absolutely. And the one I'm looking at right now is dated March 8th. So it's pretty recent, as of maybe a couple of weeks ago, if I'm looking at the calendar correctly. Good things to have at your disposal, especially if you're the CISO of an organization, or if you're in information security. This is the kind of information that you do need.
Well, as we end this up, I want to make sure to remind people it's not all gloom and doom out there. So the good news is COVID numbers are going down. Our team is even looking at getting back to in-person events. Probably too many in a short amount of time. But things are looking up again from a day-to-day basis. And we don't want to make sure that everybody's focused on the negative at all particular times, but that's what gets in the news these days. But on behalf of Vic, Theresa, and myself, I want to thank you all for listening to our particular episode of the Cohesity View, and look forward to having you come back and view the next one once we get it recorded. Thanks again.